WNYC is supported by Audible.com, provider of more than 180,000 audiobooks and spoken word audio products. Get a free audiobook of your choice at audiblepodcast.com/Brian.
I'm Sarah Koenig, the host of the Serial Podcast. Julie Snyder and I are coming to BAM on Friday, September 25th at 8 p.m. Julie and I created Serial together, and we'll talk about what goes into making binge-worthy journalism. Ticket information is at bam.org.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. A new report from urbanist Richard Florida and his colleagues at NYU describes New York City's astounding economic resiliency after 2 hurricanes, 2 financial crises, and 1 world-altering terrorist attack. But as we all know, these epic events have left us with a different kind of inequality and class structure than the city had seen before. So we will hear how Richard Florida and company describe the city's simultaneous phenomenal success and daunting new class divide. He teaches at NYU and the University of Toronto, and he joins us with Stephen Pedigo, Director of Creative Cities and Civic Innovation at the NYU School of Professional Studies. So, Richard Florida, welcome back.
Great to be back, Brian. Thanks for having
us. And Stephen, forgive me, say your last name correctly for me.
It's Pedigo.
Stephen Pedigo, Professor Pedigo, welcome to WNYC.
Thanks for having us.
So, Richard, you're famous for being the great optimist about cities that grow their creative class, but you write that even you were surprised by the comeback of New York since 2007. How so?
So on the one hand, it's optimism on steroids. And we've talked about this. During the Great Recession, people said New York was finished. It would be eclipsed either by London, but more likely a new startup Asian city. And as an economic crisis decimated our financial markets, so too would go New York. And what we found is nothing seems to take New York out, as you said in that great intro. Hit with body blows from natural disasters to economic crises to terrorist attacks, all in a quite short span of time, a decade and a half. New York is back and its economy is stronger than ever, but then optimism confounded. As New York has come back, I think few would have anticipated that we would have no longer face an urban crisis so much a failure, right? The old 1970s fiscal crisis, but a new urban crisis of tremendous success and these gaping divides. And I think in the report, Stephen and our colleagues, Rosemary Scanlon, Hugh Kelly, and others, we dug deep and found when we looked within Manhattan, but outside of Manhattan to the other boroughs, you could see flourishing pieces of an economy and then a much larger part of the city that's unfortunately not keeping pace.
And you see an ongoing evolution from a finance-driven economy to a full-blown creative economy, as you call it. Richard, what is a full-blown creative economy?
Well, I think this has been going on for 20 or 30 years, and it's kind of the crisis made this evident. That's the crisis kind of cleared away all the clouds. And, we used to think of New York's economy as primarily finance or finance, insurance, and real estate. What we've seen, and Stephen did the analysis, this remarkable analysis he did with industrial and occupational data, is that it's really arts, media, the digital sector, technology startups that have become kind of the dominant economic cluster, if you will, the most competitively advantaged. So New York still remains the world's greatest finance center. Perhaps only London can challenge it. But it also has become the world's leading media, and increasingly music and entertainment center. Of course, vying with L.A. and London, who are also quite competitive there. So I think we've seen the economy diversify even further than it had and become much more of a knowledge-based or creative economy.
And I think we should say, Stephen, that your definition of creative class includes things like science and engineering and software development, not just arts and culture.
That's right. I mean, when you think about the creative class, it's people that get sort of paid. Well, we like to say just get paid to think for a living, right? People that are working with their minds. And so that includes technologists, includes people in arts and culture, professional, and then education, right? These folks that are working in places like NYU and Columbia, like myself. So it is folks that get paid to think for a living. And I think what's actually interesting about the report is that it is surprising to look at the creative class in Manhattan. We're not surprised that this is Arts and Creative Center, but some of the things that we did is we actually looked at all of the boroughs. And when you look at places like Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx, there is actually creative centers that are emerging there. So, for instance, in the Bronx, you see large concentrations of folks who are working in education and healthcare. If you look at Brooklyn, you see the bubbling of an emerging technology healthcare scene. The same thing that's happening in Queens, right?
Is that considered creative class, though? Because I thought that's sort of the mass. Certainly teachers are professionals. There's a lot of healthcare professionals, but healthcare is also an engine for service economy jobs now. So is that considered creative class by your definition?
We would absolutely include the folks that are doctors and nurses, therapists, et cetera. So some of the higher elevated levels of education required in healthcare, bioscience, et cetera. So some of those folks absolutely would be included part of the study as we looked at those.
And it's not just our research. In the past couple of weeks or months, the folks at the Center for an Urban Future, who do great work, also documented that New York's driving force is its creative economy. They define it slightly differently, and I think for folks listening in, the big thing for us, in addition to all of that, is the fact that New York has become the world's second most important high-tech startup scene. And our work documents that. We find $3 billion in venture capital funding flowing into the city. But also, a report last week by a group that characterized startup ecosystems around the world. They gauged every city around the world, put New York in number 2 spot behind the San Francisco Bay Area. And I think if you had asked somebody 20 years ago, would New York be a startup high-tech center that would surpass Boston or Seattle, where Microsoft, they'd have said, are you on planet Zing? And I think the fact that New York has developed this startup scene to us was quite dramatic, and it suggests that startups are increasingly drawn to more of an urban center than the kind of older suburban, nerdistan, if you will, the office park that used to seem to drive technology in the future. And that, of course, Brian, puts pressure on real estate prices, office space, housing, and create some of these problems that the report also documents.
And creative class jobs, your report documents, pay better than average because you have creative class jobs at a third of New York City jobs, but more than half the total wages. And you have a chart that shows finance and healthcare may include more jobs, but New York has a big creative class advantage compared to other cities. And that's, I guess, Richard, what you were just laying out. So, listeners, anything you want to say or ask about the rise of the creative class economy in New York City, despite 2 hurricanes, 2 financial crises, and 1 world-altering terrorist attack in the last 15 years, or the new kind of inequality in class structure that it has also produced? 212-433-WNYC for Richard Florida and Stephen Pettigo from NYU, 212-433-9692. And let's get more into the weeds about the divide. You sound in the report kind of like Mayor de Blasio when you say minimum wage to $15, massive affordable housing programs, and better mass transit, especially bus rapid transit with dedicated bus lanes, because that can be created so much faster than new subways. Are these the mainstream? Are these the solutions that you're advocating in the report, Stephen?
I just want to back up one minute, Brian, and then let Stephen take those on. I think for folks listening in, it's important to point out that while the creative economy and the tech economy is sprouting up across the city, it is massively concentrated in Manhattan. That a large, nearly 1 million of the 1.4 million of these good, high-paying knowledge jobs remain in Manhattan. And when you look across the outer boroughs or the other boroughs, Brooklyn has been claimed to be a rapidly up-and-coming borough, and it has some of this, but it's far, far behind Manhattan. So that's the one thing. Manhattan remains the centerpiece of this. The second thing that's even more disturbing to us is that
them's fighting words in Park Slope, by the way, and Prospect Heights.
While the creative class worker, the knowledge worker, the professional worker, the tech worker is taking home a pretty good amount of money, on average $85,000, $90,000 in Manhattan, less than that in the other boroughs. Mm-hmm. The service workers, the people who prepare our food, take care of our kids, take care of our homes, run our hospitality and tourism are those healthcare assistants and aides in the hospitals, teacher assistants, and so forth. They're making $30,000, and they're falling further behind, and they're 50% of New York City's workforce, and in the other boroughs, 52%. So I think the divide is really a divide between a knowledge economy or a professional economy that a third of New Yorkers participate in, and a terribly lagging low-wage routine service economy that more than half of New Yorkers participate in, and they're unfortunately falling further and further behind. And I think in that spirit, we think something needs to be done, and that Mayor de Blasio has started this, but I think we even believe it needs to go further.
And so, Stephen, you frame class in three categories today's economy. Before we get back to the specific solutions: creative class, service class, and working class. So what's the difference between service and working class?
Yes, so service class is exactly the type of people that Richard just described, people that maybe walk your dog, take care of your kids, work, teachers' aides, etc. When you start to think of the working sector, those are some of the blue-collar workers, right? Folks that work in transportation tend to work in manufacturing, production, so the traditional sort of, as you would think about, blue-collar jobs. I think the interesting thing about Richard, sort of to highlight the thing that Richard's talking about in terms of the service sector, in fact, if you look at New York's economy, the fastest growing sector in New York's economy is actually the service sector, and it's growing rapidly, right? It's growing about 9%. So it is a fast-growing divide. So not only is divide present, but it's going to continue to get wider as the service sector continues to grow much faster.
So on housing, Richard, for example, when you say go further than Mayor de Blasio, he's got his 200,000 units to be created or preserved of affordable housing. You're right that he can go even further with things like land trusts. Is that worth taking some time to define?
Yeah, I think a couple things, and I just want to put this in a framework that goes a little bit beyond Mayor de Blasio. When you talk to many economists and people who study cities, they tend to believe if we just build more housing, if we just release the restrictions, we'll get more housing built. And I think what's happened in New York, and I think callers would agree, we've done that, and you know what we've gotten? More luxury housing. So that we need a variety of approaches to affordable housing, and it's not like everything's going to work. We're in a period where we have to experiment. We have to build more affordable housing. We might need to provide, and we talk about providing rental assistance. We talk about the need to include land trusts. But the other thing, and I think that's really important, we say that, and this is where we say go beyond the mayor to some degree, that just working on the housing side will be great, but it won't solve the problems. People need to be – the affordable housing crisis is not simply about building housing. We had Seth Pinsky, who worked for Mayor Bloomberg, and he framed it very nicely at our opening event. He said affordability usually means not enough income to rent or buy housing. So that's where that minimum wage comes in, and that's where upgrading these service jobs into good-paying middle-class jobs. And then finally, if we don't have the transit we need, we're constrained to living in the places that are near transit, and the prices spike. So we definitely need a transit strategy to open up new places for more development and more intensive development. So I just want to say that it's all of a piece. Housing, better incomes, minimum wage, better jobs, and more transit have to go together. Any one of those things alone can't work. It needs to be all of a single piece.
Richard Florida and Stephen Pedigo from NYU. Stephen has this great title. Do I have your title right? This is a great title if I have it right. Director of Creative Cities and Civic Innovation at the NYU School of Professional Studies. Are you really a director of creative cities?
I try to be, yeah.
That's a great job. Alex in Battery Park City, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi, Brian. Thanks, guys. Very interesting conversation. I agree in a lot of cases that the creative economy is obviously booming. I think you see a new, even though it's attached to the central business district, Dumbo is a good example of a new neighborhood where it's been transformed into an office park type place. I was wondering what you guys think about places like Willets Point or maybe further outer borough developments for office space for new places for creative class, like you said, connected to transportation. How do you feel about that in the whole affordable housing, creative class, opportunity for work discussion?
Yeah, I just had not the neighborhoods that you just mentioned, but I had a group of 15 high school students here this week doing a high school city building program, and I took them out to Queens, particularly Long Island City. And one of the things that's amazing what's happening out with the Long Island City Partnership and organizations like Coalition for Queens is that you are starting to see a sprouting of a creative economy in those places because of the types of space that's available, this industrial sort of raw type of office space that's become really, really interesting. And it's becoming popular with creative companies because you can start to see the mix and the messiness of different types of companies come together. And as you talk to the folks in Long Island City, that seems to be the real appeal for the types of companies, and particularly creative companies that they're attracting to that areas, is that types of interesting Class B or C office space, not your A type of office space, but these types of companies are looking for flex space, place that can be interesting, big windows, the types of space that sort of we're in today, right? That's interesting and unique. And I think you start to see that.
But how far from Manhattan can this really go? I mean, he said Dumbo, which last I looked was down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass, which is to say it's 5 feet from Manhattan. Long Island City, too. Willets Point, which he also mentioned, is, I think, in another category. And if it were to work there, then it sets a different kind of precedent, Richard.
So I think you put your finger on it, that this is massively concentrated in Manhattan in a way that helped the city or Manhattan rebound, but bodes ill for the city's future. The transit lines all come into Manhattan, and we're not talking about in this report where the creative and the professionals and the techies live. They may well live in Park Slope and other places, but to this day, most of them, the vast majority of them, work in Manhattan. That is why we need a strategy for dispersing, disaggregating, and clustering this creative economy in more of these outer places. And I think what's happening, and I think Stephen and the caller are right about this, what's happening in the national evolution of the city is that everything clusters very tightly in parts of lower Manhattan, Chelsea, Soho, Tribeca, and all the rest. And then as this creative group, this group of professionals gets priced out or desires a different kind of lifestyle, they move to Brooklyn and further out. And then eventually, with smart strategy and the right transit strategy, you can develop nodes and clusters of activity out there. But I think this just won't happen on its own. And what we'll end up with is more and more pressure on office and residential real estate markets in Manhattan. And again, just to go back to the mayor, it's not just about affordable housing. It's about building an economy. And building an economy requires this clustered kinds of development, active strategizing to build up these places, transit connectivity, and particularly not just building the knowledge piece of this economy, upgrading those low-wage jobs so that they can become the new middle-class jobs.
Eric in Astoria, you're on WNYC. Hello, Eric.
Yes, hi. I'm an independent inventor that grew up just a few miles from where the Xerox machine was invented in Astoria. And I was wondering, separating the creative types between techies and programmers that may work for larger companies from smaller artists and independent inventors, how sustainable do you think New York is going to be, considering the fact that rents are rising for smaller, independent inventors and creative types?
Yeah, this is a central question, Stephen, and I think your report and the conversation we've been having almost frames creative class workers as the professional successes, and then the high cost of living in New York really plagues the service economy workers and the working class workers. But really, we've done so many shows on how artists can't live in New York anymore, and so what's going to happen to New York as a creative hub if you can't afford to live here anymore? So how do these things exist at the same time?
Well, one of the things the report actually does is actually look at this idea of the freelance creative economy. And so, in fact, what we found in the report is actually when you look at the recession, when the recession first hit, there was obviously the boom of this freelance economy, partly with the creative economy. But as the economy has recovered, we have seen, and prices have risen, we have seen a lot of these freelance folks go back to typical creative payroll jobs. I mean, I think that the thing that becomes a challenging issue is just as the point that Richard has mentioned, as you think about this idea of a freelance, free agent creative economy, the question is how do you how do you provide the benefits and the support to make those folks successful, right? So this idea of better affordable housing, do we have some types of housing policies around that provides some had said maybe control and rent, et cetera, right? So there is still this idea of needing this. But there is something to be said about some of this idea of the freelance sort of creative economy also giving life to a lot of these outer boroughs, right? As Richard says, a lot of these folks continue to get pushed out. They continue also to be the urban pioneers, right? The folks that continue to help revitalize a lot of these neighborhoods, particularly not only in New York, but also in the larger metropolitan area here, and places like New York, for instance.
There are neighborhoods left to revitalize in New York City by starving artists?
Well, so I would say this, a couple of things in which the data now are pretty clear. There has been a lot of heat about artists and musicians being pushed out of New York. And that is certainly true, that areas of Soho that when I was a very young boy and a college student were affordable for artists have become unaffordable for artists. But when you look at the data, the New York City and New York metropolitan area, along with Los Angeles, remains by far the dominant location, not just in terms of absolute numbers, in terms of any way you want to control that for population. The dominant location by far for independent artists, visual artists, fashion designers, independent musicians. So, yeah, it's hard, but no place, take Chicago, the third largest city, it lags by an enormous amount New York and Los Angeles. And yes, there has been some migration of artists to Los Angeles. Los Angeles is actually picking up steam. But the real point that this report, and this is really important for folks listening in, the divide within the creative class or the professional class is one thing. And for every artist who gets pushed out, it's terrible. And New York loses some energy. And many of those places can find more affordable housing in other boroughs or in New Jersey. But the divide that separates this whole group from the service class is really troubling. You're talking about a divide that is large and growing, with people having to work multiple jobs and have multiple family members and commute exhausting distances. So I think I just want to put my finger, while a lot of heat is spent on artists being pushed out, and it's a very important issue, the much bigger issue New York City faces is this gasping class divide between its knowledge class and its service workers.
And so we're out of time, except to say that even the revitalization of neighborhoods by pioneering starving artists, if we want to still call them that, is a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, it improves neighborhoods. On the other hand, for the service class and working class people, they are the harbingers of gentrification, and they're going to get priced out from yet another place they're living.
Exactly, and that's why we need a comprehensive strategy that works not just on the housing side, but on the job side, the income side, the minimum wage side, and on the transit side together.
All right, very interesting new report about the upside and the downside of the New York City economy from Richard Florida and Stephen Pedigo from NYU. Thank you both very much for sharing it with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Brian.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Coming up next, is this any way to build an American Major League Soccer fan base by bringing in washed-up European stars? My next guest says the answer is yes. Stay with us.